Well, now Bernie Sanders, he is, of course, the independent senator running for the Democratic presidential nomination as a Democratic socialist. Today at George Washington University, just blocks from the White House, he made a case that all three labels draw, in fact, on a single progressive tradition, one that fits this moment, he says, in time and this particular president. Listen.
It is my very strong belief that the United States must reject that path of hatred and divisiveness, and instead find the moral conviction to choose a different path, a higher path, a path of compassion, justice, and love. And that is the path that I call democratic socialism. Today, in the second decade of the 21st century, we must take up the unfinished business of the New Deal and carry it to completion. This is the unfinished business of the Democratic Party and the vision we together must accomplish.
Tonight we'll explore the implications of that, the cost of taking up that unfinished business, as well as the price to be paid for not trying. With that, let's welcome 2016 and now 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders, thank you for being with us. I want to talk to you about your speech and this idea of a 21st century economic bill of rights, which is what you were really focusing on today. Very quickly, though, just your reaction to what the president told George Stephanopoulos, that he would, in fact, take a look at opposition research or anything offered from a foreign government, even an adversary, and then maybe call the FBI.
Well, Anderson, to tell you the truth, I am not exactly shocked. I think we have a president who neither understands the Constitution of the United States or respects the Constitution, somebody who does not believe in the separation of powers, and somebody who thinks he's above the law. I mean, that is why I believe the House should begin impeachment inquiries on Trump. So no, I'm not shocked.
What changed your mind on beginning impeachment inquiries? Because it is something of an evolution for you.
No, not really. I mean, I'm not here to tell you that we should impeach Trump. In fact, I don't even know that there are the votes in the House to impeach him, and I doubt very much there are the votes in the Senate to convict him. You need 2/3 of the Senate, 67 votes. But I certainly think that the American people need to understand what this president has done, his contempt for the law. And I think that is the process we undertake when we begin an impeachment inquiry.
In the speech today, you talk about a 21st century economic bill of rights, and you hearken back to FDR and are kind of pitching this as a continuation of FDR's legacy, even Martin Luther King Jr. Can you explain how this is pertinent to a vision of democratic socialism?
Absolutely. Back in 1944, in a little remembered State of the Union speech, it was at the end of World War II, and Roosevelt said, look, we have a Bill of Rights in this country and we have a Constitution, I'm paraphrasing him, which says that we have all kinds of great rights. We have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all of that is great. But what we do not have is an economic Bill of Rights. We don't guarantee a decent standard of living to all of our people. That's what he said, and he died a year later. And in fact, that mantle has never really been picked up. So what I am saying today is that are we truly free? And this is in a sense what Roosevelt was saying. If you're going out and you're working 70 or 80 hours a week because the wages you're working under are starvation wages, are you free if you can't afford to go to the doctor in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and you get sicker or maybe you die because you can't afford health insurance? Are you free if you are a young, bright person but you can't afford to go to college, or you leave school $50,000 or $100,000 in debt? Are you free if you're sleeping out on the street tonight? Anderson, 500,000 Americans, including many veterans, are sleeping out on the street tonight. So what I am saying, picking up from Roosevelt, that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, now is the time to finally say that economic rights are human rights, that everybody in this country deserves a job at decent pay, that health care is a human right, that a full education is a human right, a clean environment is a human right, affordable housing is a human right, retirement security. We got millions of old people, senior citizens of this country, who literally cannot afford the prescription drugs they desperately need.
I mean, you are leaning into democratic socialism. Now, obviously, everybody's known you're democratic socialist, but I mean, you are clearly trying to sort of explain what your view of what that means to an American population and many people who hear the socialism part,
right,
maybe not the democratic part, and President Trump ultimately will be yelling Venezuela at you as much as possible.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point. And the other point that I made today is that, in fact, people like Donald Trump are also socialists, except they are corporate socialists. They are prepared and do provide hundreds of billions of dollars every single year in subsidies and tax breaks to large corporations and the wealthy. Anderson, you will remember very well the Wall Street bailout. Now, Wall Street is the epitome of unfettered capitalism. That's what they believe. Except when their greed and illegal behavior nearly destroyed the economy, they went begging to the Congress. They were big-time socialists, and they said, we need federal help. Give us $700 billion from the Treasury and trillions of dollars in low-interest loans from the Federal Reserve. You got the fossil fuel industry today, which is literally destroying the planet, and they get billions of dollars in subsidies and tax breaks. You have Amazon, owned by the wealthiest person in this country, Jeff Bezos, made $11 billion last year. That's what Amazon made in profits. They didn't pay a nickel in federal income taxes. So, in fact, you got Donald Trump himself, as part of his housing endeavors, received tens and tens of millions of dollars in subsidies and tax breaks. So you do have socialism in this country, except, as Martin Luther King reminded us, it's socialism for the very rich and unfettered individualism for the poor.
We're going to take a quick break. I want to continue this conversation. It's an important one with Senator Sanders just a moment. Still have more ground to cover, including, as we've just started touching on, big money, President Trump's attack on Democrats writ large, and his take on socialism, and the senator himself. A lot more ahead. We'll be right back. Sanders tonight about embracing the label that President Trump and even some Democrats treat as an epithet, socialist, in his case, democratic socialist, which the senator today sought to weave into a progressive tapestry, as it were, tracing back to the New Deal and before. He also cited Franklin Roosevelt's open scorn for government organized by money, as FDR called it, seeming to welcome, as FDR did at the time, the attacks on him that have already begun. Here's President Trump at a Republican fundraiser in Iowa last night, painting Democrats as angry and extreme.
The Democrat Party has never been angrier. They're so angry. Do you ever see people so angry? For what? For what? These are angry people. Every day the Democrat Party is becoming more and more unhinged and more extreme. They're going crazy. Do you love it? I sort of love it, right?
Back now with Senator Sanders. You talked today in your speech about compassion, justice, and love as sort of the hallmarks of how you see leadership and your leadership. You know how the president's going to paint your talk of democratic socialism. Besides, Venezuela, do enough Americans know what you mean by that and what that actually looks like?
Well, Anderson, that's why I'm on your show tonight.
Well, that's why I'm asking you.
Look, what we have to understand, for example, the United States is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right. In many countries in Europe, Germany for one, you go to college and the cost of college is zero. I think in Finland they actually pay you to go to college. In most countries around the world, the level of income and wealth inequality, which in the United States today is worse than at any time since the 1920s, with 3 families owning more wealth than the bottom half of America, that level of income and wealth inequality is much less severe than it is right here in the United States.
But as you know, the taxes in many of those countries are much higher than they are, the individual personal taxes much higher than they are in the United States.
But I suspect that a lot of people in this country would be delighted to pay more in taxes if they had comprehensive health care as a human right. I live 50 miles away from the Canadian border. You go to the doctor anytime you want. You don't take out your wallet. You have heart surgery. You have a heart transplant. You come out of the hospital. It costs you nothing. Your kids in many countries around the world can go to public colleges and universities tuition free. Wages in many cases are higher. So there is a trade-off. But at the end of the day, I think that most people will believe they're going to be better off when their kids have educational opportunities without out-of-pocket expenses, when they have health care as a human right, when they have affordable housing, when they have decent retirement security. I think most Americans will understand that that is a good deal.
When somebody is looking at you as a candidate, when someone is looking at Senator Elizabeth Warren as a candidate, both progressive candidates, obviously, there are now several polls that have you trailing Elizabeth Warren. It's kind of ridiculous to look at polls at this stage of a primary battle. But she does not have the label Democratic Socialist. You do. Is it a liability?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Look, I mean, I certainly have known Elizabeth for many, many years, and she's a friend.
But she says she's a capitalist.
Yeah, I know. And I know many of the other candidates who are, in my view, knowing them personally, well-intentioned and decent people who want to do the right thing. But here is the point, Anderson, that I want to make. One of the reasons that so many Americans are dispirited about the political process is they hear candidates come forward and say, I want to do this, and I want to do that, and I want to do that, but nothing happens. And the reason for that is not that the candidates are lying. It is we have to deal with the reality that we don't talk about too much. And that is the power structure of America, the fact that the folks on Wall Street, in the drug companies, in the insurance companies, in the military industrial complex, in the fossil fuel industry, have so much power that no president alone, not me, not anybody else, can do it alone. And that is why I talk about us, not me, in our campaign, why I talk about a political revolution. If you want to transform our energy system and you want to combat climate change, words are not good enough. We have to bring millions of people together to tell the fossil fuel industry they will not continue to destroy this planet. You want Medicare for all? You're going to have to stand up to the insurance companies. You want to cut the cost of prescription drugs in half, which is what I think we should do, you're going to have to stand up to the incredibly wealthy and powerful pharmaceutical industry.
And you're going to have to get it, and you're going to have to get it through Congress.
You're going to have to get it through Congress, but you're not going to get it through Congress when lobbyists and big money interests control Congress. The only way that real change ever takes place, Anderson, now and in the past, is when millions of people stand up and are prepared to fight for that. And if anybody tells you that they're going to bring about real change in this country and they're going to sit down in Capitol Hill and they're going to go negotiate this and that, they're not being quite honest. Because you're going to have to take on Wall Street and all of these other powerful special interests. And the only way that change happens, whether it is the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the labor movement, the only way it happens is when people stand up and fight back. So what this campaign is about is bringing together a mass movement of people, and I'm very proud that we have over 1 million volunteers already.
Senator Sanders, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to return to the breaking news just ahead. I'll talk to a key member of the House Oversight Committee about his reaction to the president's remarks to ABC News that he thinks he'd accept foreign help in the 2020 election. More now on breaking news from the top of the hour. President Trump's interview with ABC News. The president saying, quote, I think I'd want to hear it, unquote, if a foreign government offered information on his 2020 opponents. It's a pretty astonishing remark given what's taken place over the past 2 years. Joining me now is Congressman Jerry Connolly, a Democratic member of the House Oversight Committee, which today voted to hold both Attorney General Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross in contempt of Congress over that contentious proposal to include a citizenship question to the 2020 census. Congressman Connolly, first of all, your reaction to what the president has now said about kind of being open for business to get what he terms opposition research, even if it's from Russia or China or some foreign power.
Well, I think the president has reopened the whole question of collusion and negated 2 years of denial of collusion. You know, he's fond of saying no collusion, no collusion. Did I mention no collusion? And today he said, I would welcome collusion. I would gladly accept opposition research or analysis by a foreign power against one of my political opponents. That's the very definition of collusion, Anderson.
Right. By the way, opposition research might be disinformation, it might be false information, right, that could be damaging to opponent. Some of your colleagues in Congress tonight are calling for impeachment proceedings to begin. Do these comments from the president, I mean, does that change your mind in any way? Does it affect it? Does it warrant it?
Well, it certainly affects it, and it pushes us further and further in that direction. We have a process that's underway. You mentioned in the intro, our committee today, for example, voted for contempt citations against Secretary Wilbur Ross and the Attorney General, Mr. Barr, on a different issue, the citizenship question. But across the board, I think the walls are collapsing on Mr. Trump, and I think he's helping the process, ironically, with comments like he made today. So I think there's almost an inexorable move toward impeachment. I don't think we're there yet. I think we have to let this process sort itself out. But he's certainly making it much more difficult for himself.
And in terms of that contempt vote today, what happens now?
Well, I think we go to court. We passed yesterday on the floor a resolution that basically empowers committee chairmen like ours, Elijah Cummings, the chairman of the Oversight and Reform Committee, to go directly to court to enforce the subpoena. So hopefully that short circuits the process. It doesn't completely solve the problem of the time lapse in courts, but again, I think it makes it more imminent and more real for those who were subpoenaed and facing this contempt citation.
Could the Department of Justice and Democrats on your committee still work out a deal before this actually moves to a court fight? Because, you know, the House Judiciary Committee, they were able to reach an agreement with the DOJ.
Yes, and they did in the face of the threat of a criminal contempt citation. So, yeah, I think that's possible. But I have to tell you, so far, the administration, led by the Attorney General and by Secretary Ross, has basically thumbed its nose at our request. They produced 17,000 documents, most of which are heavily redacted or redundant, documents we already possess. They've been entirely unresponsive. Not a single document in response to this very specific request we made with regard to the citizenship question.
Congressman Connolly, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Anderson. Thank you.
On a very Good evening. The President of the United States says that if a foreign government came offering their election help this time around, and I'm quoting, I think I'd want to hear it, he said. In other words, the central point of the Mueller report, a foreign adversary, including Russia, seeking to influence American democracy. The man who took an oath to defend it says he's okay with that and says his FBI director who thinks otherwise is wrong. And Vladimir Putin's help? Fine by him, apparently. He says it's done all the time, just normal opposition research, says President Trump. History says otherwise. It is not done all the time, or even some of the time. It's not normal. And as all this comes at the end of a day full of other breaking news, including new reporting on the president's efforts to investigate the investigators. In addition to that tonight, Hope Hicks, a longtime campaign aide, former White House communications director, and one-time member of the president's inner circle, has agreed to testify before the House Judiciary Committee. Now, the question will be, will the White House try to stop her from talking about what she saw and heard, which might have been plenty during her time in the West Wing? So that's just ahead, along with my conversation with presidential candidate Bernie Sanders on a very important day for his campaign. I'll talk about all of that, but we need to start with what the president told ABC News' George Stephanopoulos about foreign meddling. Listen.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from
information provided by a foreign country, notably a foreign adversary, and in doing so completely overlooking the fact that this could probably would be disinformation, in other words, completely phony. And to endorse that, and then in doing so undercut the FBI and its director, is just incredible. And I can't get over the duplicity of it. Here, all the criticism about the infamous dossier, and you can't use it because it's not valid. You can't accept it. And then in this case, well, and it's okay. And we're looking to the future here. We're not talking about the past. I thought Josh Campbell in the previous segment made some great points about that.
Well, I'm reminded of when candidate Trump said, Russia, if you're out there, I'd love to get those, missing Hillary Clinton emails, the 30,000 emails, if you're listening, Russia. And we know from the Mueller report that hours later, Russian hackers made attempts. It's essentially kind of echoing that again. I mean, it's basically a clarion call saying, you know what? If a country came to me again, I'd listen to it.
Yeah, the Russians are going to they were going to do this. They're going to repeat what they did in 2016. They're going to repeat it in 2020. And now, what President Trump has done is encouraging them to do so. Again, it's just it's stunning.
Yeah, and I mean, again, people just kind of roll their eyes at this point. It bears repeating. This is not normal behavior of a president. I'm not even sure I don't even know if he understands or just doesn't care what the ramifications of this are. But if any other president had said anything resembling this, Republicans in Congress would have understandably, called him a traitor.
Anderson, can you imagine if Barack Obama, if he were still president somehow, said something like that? The Republicans would be going nuts over this. It's the president, hard to describe.
The president is saying that the FBI director is wrong on this. I mean, Chris Wray is the man he appointed. Again, if you're Christopher Wray, how do you react to this tonight? Because I mean, again, this goes against. He's saying don't. I mean, he said maybe I would, I'd get the information and then maybe call the FBI. In other parts of this interview, he talks about how, he's never called the FBI for anything. Maybe he's kicked people out of his office, but that he would never pick up the phone and call the FBI.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised that he'd never call the FBI. That's not a startling revelation. I mean, he just said flat out, Chris Wray's wrong. And Chris Wray is not wrong. I mean, there are legal implications here. And if you get information provided by a foreign nation state, particularly if it's coming from the likes of an adversary like China or Russia, to me, the first duty is call the FBI.
I mean, if a foreign government reached out to an American citizen, someone said they were from, Chinese intelligence or from a Chinese think tank and reached out to American citizen, with asking for documents or willing to give some documents for, some sort of a contact. If that American citizen didn't contact the FBI, they could get in trouble.
Well, they could. I mean, depending on the circumstance, that could easily happen. Yeah.
What do you think this sends? What message does this send to foreign governments? You think like Russia? I mean, we talked about this a little bit, but essentially, you really believe this? It sends a message to them that go ahead, the gates are open for 2020, and I'm open for business on this.
Oh, exactly. I mean, this just simply encourages them to do something they're going to do anyway. And by the way, because of the revelations of the level of detail in the Mueller report, which the Russians have clearly already gone to school on, it's going to be harder to detect what they're doing.
Yeah.
And now we have the president essentially encouraging the Russians to continue to do what they did in 2016.
Yeah. General Clapper, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Had a problem with the mic there at the end. Apologize for that. Joining us now is CNN legal analyst Laura Coates, former Republican presidential candidate, U.S. Senator, and current CNN senior political commentator Rick Santorum. With us as well as CNN senior political analyst David Gergen, advisor both Democratic and Republican presidents dating back to the Nixon White House. David, I don't even know how to pose a question about this, but were you surprised that the president would say this given all that has happened thus far?
Shocked but not surprised. Yeah, this has sort of become standard fare, unfortunately, for a president. Listen, Anderson, I think one needs to distinguish legally, and Laura can elaborate on this. But the Lawfare, which is an online publication that's highly respected, had an analysis of the law regarding this, and it makes a distinction between if you're on a campaign and receive information from the Russians, and you're not a member of the government, it's unclear that you have an obligation. But if you're in the government with a top security clearance and a person from a foreign government approaches you with information like this, especially an adversarial country, you have an affirmative obligation to call the FBI. You have an affirmative obligation, and it would be breaking the law not to call them. So I do think that, and that suggests how serious this is. Listen, I've never heard of any president before this who even talked to the Russians. I never knew of any staff that ever even talked to the Russians. It was just sort of so out of bounds, it was just unimaginable. I mean, the fact we're even talking about this is sort of startling, but it is not surprising.
Yeah, Senator Santorum, on the subways in New York, there are signs saying, if you see something, say something. We want citizens to call the police if they even, suspect something. What message does this send?
Well, I mean, let's be fair. I mean, the president said he would listen, but he was also send it to the FBI. He said he would do both. So what the question is whether he should do both or just simply refuse to get the information. But he did say he would turn it over to the FBI. So I think he was talking.
Yeah, maybe.
Well,
and also initially he did point out he's never picked up the phone for something like that, and nobody ever would, and Congress people don't do it, and that Chris Wray is wrong, that you should pick up the phone.
Yeah, look, the president throws terms maybe odd. I mean, he has sort of, as we all do, we have filler words that we throw out there and that don't mean what they say, like, I think. So I took the president for his word that he would do both, which I don't think that's necessarily inappropriate as long as he refers it to the FBI as far as looking at the information. Maybe he should, maybe he shouldn't, but I don't think there's a crime in looking at the information as long as you refer it to the proper authorities.
Laura, is this appropriate? If he looks at it, but maybe then he does decide to call the FBI?
This idea that the president of the United States is going the route of, listen, I haven't committed a crime, but if I had the opportunity to do so, perhaps I think about it, because that's what happens in the real world is extraordinarily dangerous here. There are laws on the books that say members of a foreign government, foreign nationals cannot interfere with the American electoral system. More than that, Anderson, they're very clear that an American citizen, including a campaign, cannot solicit information from a foreign national or foreign government for the purpose of doing so. So all this comes down to the idea of, look, if you are actively trying to get information, opposition research, or however you want to coin the phrase, to try to get a campaign contribution of sorts that you would otherwise have to pay for, that violates the law. The idea here that the president is saying, well, you know what, everyone is doing it, so I should be able to as well. And in the real world, we would not prosecute this. You've got a whole body of campaign contribution laws that talk about this. Now, I'll give you, Rick Santorum, what you're talking about, the idea of the laws have not actually been so well defined to define what it means to be a contribution, whether it's a value. At the bare minimum, you cannot solicit from a foreign government anything like this to interfere with our election. And in many ways, this sounds just like WikiLeaks Part 2 solicitation of all those emails.
Laura, you're introducing a bunch of facts that George Stephanopoulos never said. George Stephanopoulos didn't ask him whether he was soliciting. He said if someone came to you. So the president wasn't answering questions about soliciting information. He was saying if someone came to you and said, hey, I have some dirt, and he was talking more colloquially. And again, I think the president's word is as often are imprecise and not necessarily, that's why I think he didn't want to be interviewed with Bob Mueller, is that he tends to sort of ramble and talk about things more loosely. And I think he was talking more of a general political context that we get opposition research all the time. When you get opposition research in a campaign, you don't call the FBI. I mean, I got folks who threw information at me in all of my campaigns, and no, I never called the FBI.
Right, but did you get it from Russia or Norway?
If I knew that information was coming from a foreign source, sure, I would call the FBI.
Okay, but that's not what the president said. He didn't say yes.
He said he would.
Exactly. And
he said he would do
more. And more
more
than that, Rick, one of the points you're missing is that the overall context that George Stephanopoulos was asking the question about is what Donald Trump Jr. did. And remember that phrase, if it's what you say it is, I love it, and wanted to have more information about what was going to happen. It is a fine line, and for me, as somebody who honors the executive branch of government and knows that the President of the United States is there to enforce the law as part of his duty. The idea of skirting that fine line of when you say, well, if you'd like to give it to me and ask for more information, it's a really quick turn.
But
to
I got to get a break in. We're going to pick up this conversation after a short break. We'll continue this. It's important. Also, to this point, you'll hear for yourself the President of the United States, more of what he said to George Stephanopoulos about his own handpicked FBI director, and of course, Senator Bernie Sanders, and 2020 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders is going to be joining us in just a moment as well. Be right back. He thinks he'd accept help from a foreign power to get reelected and then maybe call the FBI if he remains meddling curious, to coin a phrase. He also, in his interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, seems awfully FBI skeptical. Here's what he said when asked about Don Jr.'s encounter with Russians who were offering dirt on Hillary Clinton, allegedly from the Russian government, and the email he got first floating the idea.
Should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, hey, I have information on your opponent. Do you call the FBI? I don't
it's
think
coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office. You do whatever
Al
you do.
Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Back now with Laura Coates, Rick Santorum, and Dave Gergen. Dave Gergen, it seems pretty clear in that he's saying, if he was Don Jr., or what Don Jr. did was totally appropriate not to call the FBI, even though he was approached by someone saying they were representing the Russian government.
I'm afraid I'm afraid that is what he said. Listen, I do think Rick Santorum makes it, I agree with him on one significant point. If you're sitting in a campaign, somebody comes in and says, I have dirt on your opponent, no matter who they're from, you're probably going to read it. As far as I know, there's no law that says you can't read it. The question becomes what you do with the information that you've received and who you've received it from. And on that, anybody who's thought about this, the first thing they would do is call the lawyer for the organization they're working for and say, what is the right thing to do with this bombshell I've just received? I went through this way back when in the Carter versus Reagan race of 1980. We got a briefing book that just appeared over the transcript that belonged to the other side. And when we discovered more about it, the first thing we started doing was calling the FBI. We did not want to, we just wanted to make sure that our skirts were clean. And that's the position you're in. But I disagree with strongly on the idea that he didn't mean maybe. The President Trump has a long history of creating loopholes for himself. He'll say something, but then he'll create a loophole which will give him a way out. And the maybe is essentially saying, well, maybe I might want to keep it. After all, think of this. I got the first load of dirt against Hillary. If I just sit here with it, maybe they'll bring me a second load. It becomes part of a practice, and it becomes very underhanded, and is what undermines our democracy ultimately.
Yeah, Senator Santorum, the first response from the president is Don Jr. gets a call on this, and he's going to call the FBI. I don't think so. No congressman would do that. That's his gut reaction. It's only later on in conversation, maybe he, in his mind, is thinking, maybe I shouldn't have said that he throws in a maybe.
Well, look, first off, Donald Trump Jr. didn't know for sure that was from the Russian government.
Right, but he thought it was.
He didn't know.
Okay, well, the email actually said it is from the Russian government.
Yeah, well, again, a lot of people say a lot of things, and it's certainly not anybody recognizable with the Russian government. And so someone says, hey, So I guess the point that I think President Trump is making is, if you get something that someone sort of alleges, you're probably going to take a look at it. And if it looks like this is a serious issue, which of course it turned out not to be, then maybe you take it to the FBI. But going to the FBI because someone, and this is what I think the president was saying, because someone claims something from something without having any kind of evidence to back it up, you probably don't do that right away.
Yeah.
David?
I just want to say one brief thing. It's worth remembering the context. This was a campaign team that was already talking to the Russians about creating a back channel from, if they get elected, a back channel from the White House directly to Moscow, to be able to go around all the authorities, all the intelligence agencies, the FBI, and everybody else. This is not a team that casually looked at something like this. They were very serious about trying to create a system that was outside the system.
Laura, if you're in the FBI, go ahead, Laura.
Let me give further context here. You're essentially saying that somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've got this really nice Lamborghini. You know I don't own the Lamborghini, but do you want to have a joyride with me? And you're saying, who among us would not get into a car that probably is stolen at that point in time? Well, the President of the United States and somebody running for the President of the United States should not actively pursue the joyride and should be at least astute enough to know, knowing that he's already been named individual number 1, I believe, in a SDNY filing about campaign finance and campaign contributions, about trying.
Obviously, she froze there. Rick Santorum, I mean, does you yourself, though, very clearly said if this was you, you would call the FBI.
Look, if I got information that, yeah, I think the president, if you look at the totality of what he said, I am a little uncomfortable with the fact that he seems to give the intimation that it may be okay to not call the FBI when you get information from our government.
Right, because Chris Wray is wrong when he says call the FBI.
Yeah,
that's
well,
what he said.
yeah, I think he was saying Chris Wray is wrong with respect to his son, Donald Trump Jr. I don't think he was saying collectively. That's how I read it. I could be wrong, but that's how I read the transcript. And so what I would say is that just the appearance that the president is giving, that it may be okay to solicit, well, not solicit, but to take information and to read it, I just think the president maybe should walk that back a little bit and say, look, I'd read it, but I would share it with the FBI, I think is the right answer.
Right. Announcing you're ready to receive information
is not a good idea.
It's kind of soliciting. I mean,
that's not a good idea.
Senator Santorum, always appreciate it. Laura Coates, David Gergen as well.